Good afternoon, good morning. Oopsie, sorry about that. Imagine a few things. Let's see, experiencing some great, cool. Oh. Imagine many things. Sorry about the technical difficulties. Imagine many things, some of them where our leaders deliver keynotes in our languages. Imagine a world where endangered languages could be preserved, where poetry and stories are not only memorized in forgotten tongues, but also a critical part of preserving our culture, enabling each other to use technology in our own spoken word, using modern day technology. We can, and today you can be an integral part of making this happen. Aing was tikons ke angamiros. Just kidding. My name is Andani.Africa, Wilhelmina Nekoto, and I'm delighted to be here today with you at the Futures and Beyond to deliver the stock on culture in data. Musings on how a fourth industrial revolution can enable and spur our art, our culture, our names, and our unity. Who am I? I'm an Owambo woman and the daughter of two Namibian veterans who settled in Khoekhoegowab after exile. By my totems, I'm known as a wolf and an eagle. And I saw that it was a full moon today, so I hope I don't transform into in the middle of this talk. With a background in software engineering, data, and rugby, former professional rugby player, to build community solutions. I love Mopane worms, so I'm not a robot, though I do have a technical background. While designing this talk, I identified three main questions that creators in the audience might have. One of them, which I'm sure has been demystified and defined in great lengths at day one and previously by the speakers, and that question is, what is the fourth industrial revolution and what is intelligence? The other two, perhaps of most importance for this talk, are what role can arts and culture play in the fourth industrial revolution, or what is the role of artists towards the fourth industrial revolution agenda? And how can we as stakeholders bridge the gap between artists and technologists, hopefully doing away with this them versus us perception? Therefore, given the questions identified, the main objectives of this talk are one, to provide an understanding and clarity on natural language processing in the 4IR agenda, like what is natural language processing and why is it important for the fourth industrial revolution? And then we'll discuss and describe the critical role of arts and culture in the NLP process. I'll then provide practical examples of cultural approaches in the NLP process, and I'll conclude by how I envision a future of what Africa-centric NLP and AI can look like, while highlight some of the amazing work done on the continent by the Masakhane family. Masakhane, who are we? We are the effort to put African languages on the NLP map, encapsulated in the spirit of Ubuntu that is inclusive, open source, continent-wide distributed, and online. So, what is the fourth industrial revolution? This is really hard. Definitions are hard, but I'm glad that the previous speakers defined this and summarized it to great lengths. So I'll dive into what artificial intelligence is. Intelligence, I really like this definition by Tutorial's Point, which I found really helpful while trying to come up with a definition. And they define it as the ability of a system to use natural language fluently, to calculate, reason, perceive, learn, solve problems, and comprehend complex ideas. And some branches of artificial intelligence include natural language processing and computer vision, but I focus on natural language for this talk. The earliest example of NLP, natural language processing, is perhaps spam detection, since its applications have evolved, including recent use cases such as digital assistants. Oh, sorry, no, that's too far. So natural language processing is the ability of a computer program to understand human speech as it is spoken. And the earliest example is probably the earliest example being speech detection, but since then it has evolved to include digital assistants, automatic speech detection for communication, and machine translation. To improve the performance of these algorithms requires data. And what does data look like? Who are we? I'm ṭONūkhoen. My name alone is a representation of my culture. My name is data. For example, the world is becoming global, and that's the problem. African text data, which powers natural language processing, is severely underrepresented in digital form. The lack of data means that the lack of tools for African languages. And this means our tools will become the same. because the little data that does exist is often Western-centric about non-African religions or just downright wrong. Therefore, there's a need for cultural data sets as a resource, and NLP as a subfield of artificial intelligence is data hungry, and fourth industrial revolution is all about data. We need to define what that data revolution means to us. So today's story is about using natural language processing through poetry and storytelling to save endangered languages in Namibia. And I invite you to see poetry and storytelling as data. But really, stories are just data with a soul. And I like this quote by Brown Green. So how are we using storytelling to save one of the most ancient language families? The Khoekhoegowab, Namibia's third largest indigenous language, and the language of the Khoi family of the Khoisan group of languages is one of those languages that are near extinction, already extinct, as we can see with the Cape Khoekhoe. However, its rich culture, it has a rich culture which is important to us towards today's pressing challenges. And if we start with definitions, I just want to start by defining what the Khoisan, or who the Khoisan are. The Khoisan is a term that was termed by Schulze, which is defined as a group of people who spoke Aboriginal languages with clicks in them. And there are 4 primary clicks, and that being the San are described as people without livestock by the Khoekhoe, or perhaps the most ancient race or oldest tribe. And the Khoekhoe are defined as people, real people, because they were herding people and cattle and sheep farmers. Khoekhoegowab is the biggest language of the Khoisan stack, and we'll define what language shift and endangered means as we go into the talk. As you can see here, we have the Khoi and the Khoisan as hunters and gatherers, and we're focusing on the Khoi language, particularly Khoekhoegowab, which is spoken by the Namakwa and the Damara in Namibia, and more recently by the Haitkom, who shifted from the tribe of the Jew dialect of the San group of the Khoisan. Quite an overload, right? But yes, this is the problem, that we're seeing a language shift from languages due to socio or economic reasons, especially amongst our traditional or ancient tribes. And if we look at the drastic history of the San, this really began in 1652. Why are we focusing on this endangered language? We saw the arrival of the Europeans in 1652, and then in the 17th and 18th century, we saw a genocide of the San and the introduction of smallpox, a pandemic that wiped out a very significant population of the San community. In the early 19th century, we saw continued genocide and language shift due to displacement and dispossession of land due to the German-Nama War, forcing the San communities along the Orange River to move much inland into mountainous areas, becoming displaced and land dispossession. In the middle of the 19th century, we saw a crisis of overhunting with the apartheid in Namibia, which saw great famine and disturbed fragile ecosystems within the San communities, as well as mobility restrictions, further displacing the Haitkom communities from the original Etosha land. Shortly after independence, when Namibia gained its independence in 1990 and then later South Africa in 1994, we saw land restitution within the San communities in South Africa, and a number of San initiative communities by the Namibian government, spearheaded by our Dr. Libertina Mavila. Today, we see, what does the San community of today look like? We see that the youth have limited heritage knowledge, the elderly have significant traditional knowledge, and the community focuses on beadwork and tracking systems, as well as tracking storytelling towards an economic future on an ancient heritage. However, in Namibia, we see the San community, particularly the Haitkom, who consider themselves as landless people because of the legal battle on land restitution in their home Etosha. Motivation in languages through storytelling. One of them, in our culture in particular, seeing culture as data, one of them was my mom. Shortly after independence, growing up in a township, Katutura, shortly after apartheid, where they weren't resettled, it was very hard for them to find their identity in an urban city and setting, and to raise children in a cultural way far from their homelands. So I was often reminded that this means, translated, is that if you forget your upbringing, your norms, your customs, that's it, you're lost, you're no longer a person. So she made me see utekwo norms as data. And I wanted to see this if this perception was true amongst my friends. So we conducted a survey to be more data informed, to ask them what their views were on traditional food and traditional clothing, whether enough efforts were going on in the preservation of languages and our culture as a whole. And the results were even more worrying than I thought. As you can see here, people found it very hard to, how frequently they ate their traditional food was very low, probably rarely, because it was difficult to cook. And that was really worrying, because I can't imagine anyone not loving, to cook pap or mopane worms. It's an exercise, but a good workout and a great meal at the end of the day. So this really inspired my coffee and data sessions. I wanted to do something about it. It was very concerning. So for the Khoekhoegowab language, I sat down with Gefro Govases to really come up with ways in which we can preserve these languages. Songs, poetry informed by the results of our previous survey in 2016. So we came up with, we wanted to create a data set that highlights the rituals, that preserves the customs and traditions and rituals and processes of the Khoekhoegowab community and the language and the Khoisan family. So of this, we wanted to document poetry, recipes, and recipes is really important, because one of my girls tried cooking traditional spinach in a pressure cooker. So imagine that being like someone who was cooking green tea in a pressure cooker, suffering severe burns. And this is because she just didn't know how to cook traditional food because of the urban settings that she grew up in. So I wanted to do something about it. The data that we collected was very minimal, about 500 sentences, but this was enough to understand the language and also train a machine translation model. And so our goal from this producing 500 sentences to 1 million sentences in as from 2021 to 2022 was to raise it by some exponential and ridiculous number, like 1 million, by 2,000%. So the goal to increase the data size, by this ridiculous exponential percentage, was motivated by a few things, the three things in particular: the importance of culture and language data and the need to preserve it, especially during a pandemic where we see the effects on the elderly as knowledge holders. On one of the websites on The Guardian, I saw this article of a husband who stopped talking to his wife and as the last speakers of this language, and their daughter knew very little. So especially when we see the effects of the pandemic and its impact on the elderly generation, it's very important to preserve this language, and also to use these data sets to be stored in a fair repository and in a fair manner to educate younger speakers. This was by my work father, Uncle Reynold, who initially challenged me to utilize my skills because his nieces refused to learn and speak to him in Khoekhoegowab. And that the urban youth population was shifting to more dominant languages like Afrikaans, especially in the smaller towns like Tsumeb and Otavi in Namibia. And the third one was to bolster intercultural and interpersonal communication and economic communities, opportunities for the marginalized communities. Also, as a software engineer, this was important in the requirements elicitation process, especially where we're designing technical solutions inspired by traditional methods. To effectively elicit more requirements in co-design required us to communicate effectively in the Khoekhoegowab language. However, the tools and the data did not exist. So step one was fundamental in understanding the traditional techniques, solutions inspired by hunter-gatherer methods. And one such project included my project on wildlife tracking, where I realized that communication would be a challenge, and to fully capture all the requirements as told in the vernacular, I needed to understand this complex language a little bit more. Step two was exactly that, an attempt to create this data sets to train a model and hopefully spur communication for future applications. That and growing concerns around language loss, especially amongst the young speakers. My focus group consisted of 3 elderly between 59 and 63 years old. And in 1 month, Jeffro Govases and I, a retired teacher, managed to create some data of traditional stories, customs, processes, and poetry inspired by the responses highlighted from the survey. But step 3, the problem was that this was still very little, right? So the impacts, sorry about that. I already mentioned that. So this data set was not enough, and we wanted to deploy data. Hence our next approach, which was to seek the wisdom of ages for their veteran stories. And it was inspired by this album by the late Jonas Ngwangwa, Stories from Exile, because I grew up in a home where storytelling was very fundamental. My parents went into exile, my mother at the age of 15, my father at the age of 21. And it was important for me to, growing up with this in this home of storytelling, I'd often scribble it down on paper. And so it was important, this papers became more, and I needed a place to store them. And I thought that, hey, why not document your stories and we can learn from your experiences. So Khoekhoegowab being the 3rd largest language in Namibia, we have no doubt that there are translators and annotators, further translating these stories from a source language to English and then back to the target language. And this is because most of our speakers, our focus group, which consists of 30 speakers, of 30 veterans who predominantly speak the Oshwamba language, we found it as a great approach to collect data and then translate it to English and Khoekhoegowab and also other languages. And from to increase or to meet this goal of creating a 1 million data set, we identified 300 veterans to contribute at least 1 story each to create a quality data set, hopefully moving from 500 sentences to ambitiously 10,000 in stage 3 between 2021 and 2022. We also wanted to identify the role of women in the struggle because this is poorly documented. How resilient were they beyond just language preservation? We also wanted to preserve our historical stories and understanding as a society to understand. And it was very important to understand the role of women, especially if we want to build further resilient and inclusive societies. But the most important was of such a data set, and the aim is to power tools that will showcase the various Khoisan groups to the world as perhaps the most ancient group in the world. And that was the main motivation, or is the main motivation. So what is the role of arts and culture towards this goal metric? We need participation from creators as custodians of and inspired by culture, our history, our society, and socioeconomic challenges. This co-design or participatory design presents new approaches to building data sets, inspiring more custom data sets that represent us as Africans, from our past cultural and historical experiences to a future that reflects our norms and lessons, and environments that are inclusive and reflective of its people. And I really like this quote by Jade, one of the founders of Masakhane, that when people training the models are also part of society that would use the model, then magic can happen. And so we need participation from creators. Creators are custodians of culture. So what does 4IR without culture look like? I invite the audience to consider this quote, that the effect of a cultural bomb is to annihilate a people's belief in their names and their languages, in their environments, in their heritage of struggle, in their unity, in their capacity, and ultimately in their self. So without creatives, 4IR will erase our culture. If there's no data, then there is no 4IR. And if there's no cultural data to inspire and power the 4th Industrial Revolution, then the 4th Industrial Revolution will erase our culture. Which brings about 2 fears. 1, that the digital world continues to exclude Africans, and 2, that technology becomes entirely dominated by the Western cultures and Western narratives. And 3, basically colonialism 2.0 in the data revolution, if we do not ensure that African narratives are represented in the digital world. So let's think about that. So what can we do about it? Fear not, there is hope, like the awesome work done by the Masakhane family. And this is how I envision a future of Africa-centric natural language processing and artificial intelligence. Like the work being done in Nigeria to translate works that matter to the society and the communities, like their own songs, their research poems, into multiple Nigerian languages. Big ups to Burna Boy and the Grammy. And collaborators between South African to gather governmental data sets, as well as the capturing of dialogue to enable translation of the ṭōN language to French, and the creation of African named entity recognition data sets to enable technology to understand our names, our places, and our history, as well as the creation of spell checkers for South African languages and capturing of speech data for the Luhia language to empower creation of educational tools. And importantly, the Masakhane Web Initiative to allow us to use machine translation and speech models by the public. So you don't need to be a practitioner or a scientist to use our models. These are some of the initiatives that we're going towards. So for further reading on the work we're doing, please read our paper. If we embed our norms and culture in the way we collect and use data, then the entire global scientific community will inherently become Africa-centric, encapsulated and guided in the spirit of Ubuntu, and making Ubuntu universal. So to read on this and more, please read on our one-of-a-kind paper with over 30 authors on this paper, and it's one-of-a-kind presentation where we all contributed or stepped in to create this really large presentation in our languages, and each reflecting. To conclude, there's data and culture is data. And we need your collaboration, creators, because we need data to power artificial intelligence. It's time to fully own our cultural reserves and minds, and only then can we brave, rejoice, dance all day in this shared prosperity. And what would this shared prosperity look like when we're part of the creative process? And here's what I'm thinking. In entertainment, we see a boost in films, movies, songs, and names that reflect us, actually bringing these stories to life rather than sitting in a cloud somewhere. So the dreaming should stop. In fashion, I see a market of recreated time fashion pieces and cultural patterns increasing sales. In education, history told and not censored, a deeper understanding of where we come from, who we are as a society, and where we want to be and how we can get there by avoiding the mistakes of the past. In terms of capacity development in this fourth industrial revolution, working with data we're familiar with makes the learning experience. I imagine it inspires creative thinking and problem solving to challenges we're familiar with. Large amounts of data, we discover insights by asking the pressing questions we're so familiar with. Engineering sustainable systems for the collection, analysis, and communication of these data enable us to extend to other smart applications like smart farming or agriculture, even wildlife monitoring and poacher detection, urban cities inspired by culture, and most importantly, the ethics in the collection, preservation, and use of data, and so much more. A cultural appreciation in the design of our communities, towns, and cities. Which all contributes towards the growth of the SMME and the SME level, both for the gross domestic product, which is measured, and most importantly, the gross national happiness, which is often neglected. Therefore, there is a need for cultural data set as a resource, and NLP, a subfield of artificial intelligence, is data hungry. And the fourth industrial revolution, being a data revolution, needs us as Africans to redefine what the data revolution should mean to us. And for that, we need to go back to our roots and see culture differently. And with that, I thank you.